Hi, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar. It's Picking Up the Pieces, Critical Decision Support After a Crisis. This is part of the Firestorm Virtual Spotlight Series, and we have some unusual things, I think, to talk about today that you should find of interest. As in all of our webinars, we'd like you to become our friend on social media, and on Facebook, we're Firestorm Solutions. On Twitter, we're at Firestorm Soul. And there is a hashtag for today's session, and that's hashtag Crisis Coach. Firestorm transforms crisis into value. And I think when we look at all the events that have been going on recently, we can see that there's a tremendous potential both for good and bad in the crises that are occurring. We help you to empower you to manage risk and crisis, and our expertise is crisis management, critical decision support, crisis communications, crisis public relations, and consequence management. Firestorm is America's crisis coach, and we're balancing this crisis and risk area and following a predict, plan, perform methodology. We have attorneys just like everybody else, and they want us to make sure that we confirm that the presentation is not complete without the accompanying oral comments and discussions, and any work product provided by Firestorm must be read in conjunction with guidance from local authorities and your organization's personal counsel. Moreover, any of the comments that we're making today should not be interpreted as legal advice or legal opinion. Today we're going to have Hart Brown, who is the Executive Vice President and Chief Operating Officer of Firestorm. Hart has joined Firestorm this month, so welcome, Hart. Glad to have you on board. And I'm Jim Satterfield, President and CEO of Firestorm. So Hart, you want to talk a little bit about what your focus is going to be or what you've been doing before, and then I would like to ask you to give an update of what's going on at ASIS right now.
Sure. Thank you, Jim. And hello, everybody, and I hope you're well wherever you may be today. So very quickly, a little bit about myself. I've now spent 20 years in the crisis management space, both in the public and private sector, as well as spending time in about 50 different countries. During my time, I've had the unfortunate, in some cases, opportunity to assist organizations as they're going through some fairly significant events, to include one of the largest bankruptcies in U.S. history, as well as the largest unfortunate event of mass shooting in U.S. history as well. I am very excited to be part of Firestorm and looking forward to working with as many of you as we possibly can to ensure that you're better prepared for those kinds of events when and if they do occur. Very quickly today, I'm coming to you from Dallas, Texas, as part of the ASIS annual seminar. For those of you that may not know much about the event, it is the largest event in the security management space, attended by about 20,000 members each year. And with that, Firestorm was specifically invited to come in and speak on 3 separate topics during this time frame. All of which have been what are considered to be hot topics or very late breaking types of situations, which are certainly in the news now. The first one is the impacts of the hurricanes and what's going on there, and how we're able to provide assistance in the recovery process in many cases in these types of situations. The second was to come in and speak directly about crisis management and on the crisis index, which you may have heard us speak on previously, but how do we prepare and how do we create metrics around our crisis management program? The third event is very specific to a cyber breach event, and certainly there's a number in the news now. And so speaking on both what's going on from the crisis management aspect, from the insurance aspect, and how that's impacting the response, as well as from a partnership and a consumer-oriented approach, how do they feel and deal with the kinds of breach events that are occurring now? So again, I'm happy to be here, certainly happy to be part of the webinar today, and I'll turn it back over to Jim, and we'll start speaking more about critical decision support. Thank you.
Thanks, Hart. And for those of you who've never been to ASIS, that's certainly an event that the networking opportunity and meeting with your peers is certainly a good one to have. We were just at the Disaster Recovery Conference down in Phoenix week before last. Again, a good turnout and an opportunity to focus on these areas. So when we think about this concept of risk and crisis, and I think we've certainly had us all focused on hurricanes and flooding and issues. Equifax has certainly brought the issue of cyber breach back into the mainstream with the number of exposures there, and then the resignations of essentially the key portions of the C-suite within the organization. It looks as this is going to be a conundrum when we look at crisis and risk and where they meet. And JFK years ago in his book talked about crisis being a blending of danger and opportunity, and it's a turning point. And so regardless of the picture that's across the image there at the top, it's going to, all future events will be trended. And I think when you add to that North Korea and the exposure there and the potential that would occur, we're facing some times that are completely different. And so we've got to think about these types of crises, what is likely to occur, how can we identify those, and how do we help focus our decisions as they need to in each of those areas. We've shared with you in the past these 5 common failures that are on the screen now, and we see these repeated over and over, and we certainly have seen them in the recent hurricanes and the responses. The largest single failure in a disaster or crisis is the ability to control your supply chain. Today, most organizations only own 10 or 15% of their supply chain, so they have a great dependency on third parties. Knowing that those third parties are prepared and what their plans are, and you need to not only look at the first level in your supply chain, but go down to that second level, would control a process. And so that is the most common failure. So if we're thinking about picking up the pieces, you're going to start with looking at your supply chain. The second greatest failure is to train employees for work and at home. The surveys that we've done across and the research show us that about 80% of employees don't know what to do in a disaster or crisis. So you're going to find yourself behind the 8 ball associated with that. And so these events have occurred, so that portion wouldn't be clear. But for those of you who are not in the middle of a crisis, now is the time to start doing that training, and you'll have a renewed interest with the events that have been going on around the world. The last portion of that, the and home, we have been able to document that less than 5% of employees across all the organizations have a disaster plan at home. If you don't have a disaster plan at home, then you're forcing your employee to choose between their family and their job, and that'll get a big return. And we'll mention this a little bit later, that there are options to look at with a book that you can download off our website called Disaster Ready People for Disaster Ready America. And it's about building a plan at home. The third is the failure to identify and monitor all threats and risks. And that's still true even in the crisis. Now that this has occurred, what's about to happen next? What's the risk or the threat that's going to come into our organization? What do we need to do? How do we monitor for those particular events? Fourth is conducting exercises and updating your plans. Testing your plans will let it know. And then finally, developing a crisis communications plan. Clearly in the crisis at this point, you are going to have to communicate and focus on the issues of coordination. You're going to have brand and reputational impacts, and you're going to have compliance issues that need to be addressed. So the way that these are managed is by focusing on that predict, plan, perform methodology, identify and involve the functions that you see here, the suppliers, functions, employees, conducting the exercises, and establishing how to monitor and communicate. It's great to think about this before the event, but even as the event has just occurred and you're in the recovery area, helping people establish how they monitor the impacts, monitor the status of your employees, monitor what's going on with your customers becomes equally important. Now, as we think about that, we all here on the call are focused around business continuity or crisis or response, disaster response, or disaster recovery, and we all know we have to run the business no matter what. People need jobs, they need support. We look at what's going on in Puerto Rico in particular and the devastation there, where they're not talking days, weeks, or months. It could be years. Think about the disruption that that's going to mean in all those lives. So everything that we've all been working on in our individual plans suddenly now come to the front line. I want to take us back just 2 steps, and then we'll jump back into picking up the pieces and what do we need to do. And the first area that I want you to think about, because it's still applicable even if you're in the middle of it, is thinking about what's involved in a hazard vulnerability analysis. And when you look at it, we look at the probability that it would occur. And you probably have done something similar to that in the upper left-hand corner on the slide of having that and looking at it. So clearly if an event is highly probable, or in this case, if you're already in it, we can see that area. We then shift over and look at the severity, the green to the right, the forewarning, the duration, the human impacts, the property impacts, and the business impacts. As you look at those things, you can see as they go to those higher levels that they're going to be significantly more disruptive on the organization. Now, maybe a little new to you is that box that's in orange in the center, and that's the mitigation. Hey, we know the likelihood, we know the severity. Is there any way to temper that? And that's to focus on looking at the mitigation, the pre-planning that you've been doing all along, associated with it, your internal resources, the external resources that you have in place, and then finally putting it at a risk level. And we're focused here on guarded, elevated, severe, catastrophic, or a black swan, something that no one has ever seen before. Clearly the hurricane doesn't fit into that category. Now you probably have a similar matrix as you see the one listed here, but I wanted to point out something a little bit different to you than maybe you have thought of with the mitigation factors. And that is to look at what happens. This one was filled out as if everything was at the highest possible level. It was highly probable. You had little to no forewarning. The event duration is longer. The human impact is extreme. The property impact is extreme. The operational, and you'll see it all comes at 100%. But if you'll notice, I put 61% over at the right-hand side. If suddenly in the hurricane area, you had strategic preparation that you'd done from a pre-action standpoint, if you had internal resources that were at that strategic level, and if you had external resources already identified, you would see that that would be lowered to 61% as a risk index. And going back to the previous slide, let me see if I can get it to advance the way that I want it to. Look over to the left at that risk level. Where you really want to focus is if that mitigated risk is at an elevated or higher level. Yes, it'd be great to handle those that are guarded at the lower, below 40%. But once you hit a 40% level from a risk level, then those should fit directly into all of your plans. So this is a dynamic process. What does this mean now as we are going on? And the reason why I talked about it being dynamic, think about as we look at infrastructure, some of the things that we're starting to hear that are going on as a result of these events. So things will be continued to be impacted. And so going back to that level makes a difference. Now, if we're shifting away from looking at the risk and looking at the impacts ahead of time or even as they're continuing development, there's one other factor that's never listed on a hazard matrix, and that's the concept of your visibility vulnerability. That's another exposure. If you look at what's going on right now with Equifax, you can see that they're at the center of a crisis coming around the cyber breach that was there, the hundreds of millions of people that were impacted directly about it. It puts a greater visibility on everything that they say and do. If I were to say United Airlines, you would think about the passenger being drugged down the aisle. If you've had a disaster like the hurricane hitting your business and your people, the message that you send to all of your employees about how you help and support them places you at a higher vulnerability because of those elements. There's a second aspect of visibility, vulnerability, and that relates to the fact that you won't be able to see through this crisis completely. It's, in a military analogy, it'd be called the fog of war that's happening. Now, we did a survey with and research with 1,000 companies looking at, did they measure their visibility in a crisis? And what you're going to see here is that 34% said, yes, we are looking at our visibility, looking at what's being said on social media, understanding how the company is viewed. A little less than a third said no, and a little more than a third said, well, how do you do that? But thinking about your visibility in the crisis and the event is a critical element as you're coming forward. So I want to jump over to the impacts for a minute and to start to tell you that we've got to think about it. If you look at the images that are on the screen, and the Mexico earthquake was just fit right into the end of this, and the devastation that's associated with that and what it means. The whole reason to understand the crisis impacts is to focus on your decisions, your actions, and your words. That will become the driving element for us to think about, because our decisions, our actions, and words are going to be colored by what's been happening. So where do we start? First, we want to start to look at what core assets are at risk in this type of situation. And we've listed several big categories to the left. You may think of others that are subcomponents. But the pie chart to the right, I want to point out, and then I'm going to ask Hart to comment some about these as we're going on. He's just finished to talk around this at ASIS. Is, you know what you know. That's that green slice of the pie to the right. And you know what you don't know. But the biggest exposure in trying to pick up these pieces is what you don't know, you don't know. And that colors all of these other areas. So when you look at these core assets, Hart, what comes to mind?
Well, a number of things certainly come to mind, and to echo the challenge in dealing with a crisis as you're involved in it is to try and avoid as much as possible learning by surprise. We already know that through any major event there are going to be things that we're going to have to deal with at that moment in time because they weren't fully anticipated. But the more that we can anticipate and get ahead of as many different kinds of things that are going to occur and be able to prepare and get past it without having to learn from that surprise moment, the more effective we'll be within that crisis space. And certainly from a stakeholder situation, and you look at a number of things that are playing out now, certainly in the news, very visible, is there are a number of individuals and actors that are starting to drive an event. And one of the challenges is if you have a customer base that's now driving your event because they weren't communicated effectively with, or they felt for whatever reason that the fault is now being placed on the company, you're really not going to be able to effectively get ahead of that potential curve and get ahead of the problem. So that communicating effectively and knowing which stakeholders need to be communicated, how they should be communicated with, and when each type of communication needs to be delivered is incredibly important in making sure that you're not having to learn from that surprise.
Thanks, Hart. And one of the things I want to point out to everyone, if you look at the order in which these are listed, they're not alphabetical. People become the first concern in any of these events, and how you communicate with them, the decisions that you make that would impact them, the actions you take to support them will color all of the response. Next, we have to have our property and our facilities operational. We move into operations, then our supply chain starts to kick in, the financial impacts. Behind the scenes around all of these, and we'll mention it later, is insurance. Do you have business interruption insurance? Is this covered? Does it tie? What are the limitations within it? And how you will go. So picking up the pieces around that becomes extremely important. And then finally, your reputation and brand. How you deal with everything above that will certainly drive the reputation and brand. Now, Bruce Blythe at R3 Continuum, the founder of the company, is an expert in crisis management. We regularly team with Bruce in a variety of things, and he uses CIA to focus first on your core assets at risk, then looking at your impacted stakeholders, identify and address their needs and concerns, providing that level of support to them, and anticipation, looking how this is likely to progress. When we saw with Hurricane Harvey that there was no driving wind current that could move it away and flooding, you look at the 51 inches of rain that collected in an area, to have over 4 feet of water is certainly going to have an impact. It's going to last a long, long time. So having that playbook and understanding it becomes extremely important in terms of being able to pick up the pieces. So how do you prepare for an incident? Open source intelligence. How are you monitoring? How do you get in touch with your people? We were doing an exercise with a bank the other day, and as we focused on that exercise, one of the individuals had worked at one of the major investment firms in the World Trade Center, and he shared in the exercise some of the differences that had occurred in that event and how it suddenly changed them. But having source of information coming in makes a big difference in those responses. Emergency response is certainly next, looking at the life safety issues in dealing with it. Those are the ones, what do you need your people to do? How are we going to communicate? If power is out, how do we communicate? Is there a rally point? Is it a virtual one? Is it a physical one? The human side of this continues to be the theme that comes together, and I think we've covered pretty much the rest of them going down, but I didn't want to skip the last two. Recognizing in these events there's going to be an increased exposure and vulnerability for a violence potential and security aspects that would become an issue. Desperate people do desperate things at desperate times. Those are issues that are going to become an element that you have to plan for and looking at it. So preparing for the incident, take your scenarios that you're concerned with, your hazard vulnerability matrix that we went over again briefly. Meet with your insurance broker asking, how do our policies respond and cover in these areas? We did an exercise in the cyber with a company, a cyber breach area, and the company looked at it, and they had 8 things that occurred in the exercise. Of those 8, 6 weren't covered by their policy. The time to find out about that is now, not in the middle of the crisis. So looking at those events, or take the events that are going on and carry the events that from these real life things that have occurred to your broker and say, show me how our policies would have responded in these areas. And I would ask for that statement in writing. It's another way to expand your understanding, and if they're telling you it's covered and later it turns out not to be, you've invoked their E&O, their errors and omissions insurance. This is an area of preparing that becomes absolutely critical for everything else. Hart, I'm going to jump to the stages of the crisis unless you want to add anything at this point.
The one thing I would add to the violence and the security conversation, and certainly that's a recurring theme going on this week with many of the individuals attending the program here at ASIS, but one of the challenges that you begin to see, and one of the things that for all of us to be cognizant of, and certainly one that I had to deal with personally in working with a number of organizations, but is when you see one event and it geographically may be separated from you, it may be a completely different type of environment or situation or industry, and what you end up seeing is there are psychological influences between individuals that are already contemplating actions like this. And when they see one, you have a tendency to see other incidents follow. So even though you may not be impacted by the initial event that you see on the news that occurs somewhere else in the world, you find very quickly that people start talking, questions start being raised, and potentially people start thinking about doing something within your organizations if that thought has already been placed in their mind. So important to stay on top of the news and what's occurring, and making sure that you're thinking about your plans, policies, and procedures in relation to the kinds of events that are occurring around the world on a day-to-day basis.
Thanks, Hart. In that copycat or even in accelerated format we're seeing, I would advise everyone to remain aware of the events that you're seeing in Europe, the number of crisis and terrorist events that have occurred within the UK this year, and it's thinking about that. What would we have done had that been in our town and directed at our organization or our people? Those types of events are likely. So where do you start? You've all done a good job. You wouldn't be on the our conversation today if you didn't already have the planning. The pre-action is all the work that you're doing in advance. At onset, that's where that emergency response plan that you have in place kicks in. Do your impact assessment. How bad is it? You do a preliminary and then a full detailed, and your crisis management plan is activated. Some of your organizations are large enough that between those two there's an incident response team or an incident response plan that could fit into that area. But clearly if it's had a material impact, and materiality is an area that we're going to talk about in just a minute, then that's at the senior level, the C-suite, the board level within your organization. As that assessment is finished, then the shift comes in activating your business continuity program and your individual departmental plans. By the way, when you're describing it, we talk about business continuity as a program. We talk about a plan at a departmental level. And you could have split this into 6 stages if you didn't. If you wanted, you could have what's the response as one stage and the recovery as another. But looking at those 2 elements, we group those together in how we respond and recover to those events. And then post, the doing of a hot wash, what went right, what went wrong, what are the lessons learned. So at this point in time, you're relying on your plans, you're relying on your workarounds. Your business impact analysis that was done as a part of your program shows you the impact on the organization if you lose a department or a process. You know the critical applications, you know the internal and external dependencies that are all spelled out. So that process, this becomes a plan of execution. Now, as we're executing on our plan, recognizing that it's a different world we're in this post-event area, because some of the things that you would expect, even if the power's out at our house and I walk and I flip the light switch, I still mentally am thinking the lights are going to be coming on. So recognizing how you operate in those environments. By the way, if you look at this chart, and if you're in the healthcare area, this is exactly the scenario that CMS, that's Medicare and Medicaid, has focused on with the CMS final rule, requiring you to have an emergency operations plan in place with an updated hazard vulnerability analysis and the plan based on it, policies and procedures, a crisis communications plan, and having training and testing. This is an opportunity to talk about these events and what they mean. I mentioned this book earlier. I wanted to show it to you. You can go and download an electronic copy off the Firestorm website. Disaster Ready People for Disaster Ready America. By the way, we can print it with your company's name and you to put it in your employees' hands. This is a way for you to show the value that you place in them. If they know their family is safe, that can be done. You can even blow a chapter in about what your plans are at work, or if you give it to your clients, how your company would help them. But thinking about your employees is absolutely critical before and during the event. So can you identify your organization's next crisis? And we boldly stay on this side, this slide, yes, we can. The reason we can do that is how you respond to the one that you're in now. That's going to determine, if you look at the response at Equifax, you see the impacts. If we think about the Flint water problem, if we think about the hurricanes, if we think about all of these elements, the response really determines that. So one of the things as we do and think about those events, people are going to be focused on what should they do and what should they say. You can count that those are going to be the first things that are coming out of those organizations. But historically, our leadership has been able to make those decisions within our companies based upon fact and data and information and policy. But when the crisis happens, you're not going to get the information. They're going to be wrong. Hart used the term surprise earlier. So the events are escalating, and it becomes a situation of survival for the organization as you're focused on those elements. But one of the things that we observed is that not all crises are equal. We always say that the worst one that ever happens is the one that happens to you and your people. But take a look at the bolded words on this page, and we're going to start to frame a way that you can help your organization understand this crisis and the severity of it. We're going to focus on the crisis dimensions of outrage, thought, and fear. We made an acronym out of that, of OFF, just simply because it's easier to remember it that way. But it's used to identify the crisis severity and intensity so that you can compare this crisis to some other crisis, or you can compare how this crisis is impacting another organization. It gives us a common basis to empower the crisis response, and it's a program that we're working on with the insurance industry now as a way that you're going to start to see this on a much more regular basis. Now, the focus then becomes on the decisions, actions, and words. We shared that earlier with you in the webinar today. If you think about what you're going to have to do in any crisis or disaster, it's what decisions do you have to make, what actions do you have to take, and what words do you have to say. Now, I want to point out we use the term words instead of communications. It really comes down to the choice of a word. Are you talking about a victim, because that immediately gets a particular stereotype? Are you talking about an employee or a member? How we categorize the responses make a big difference, and the choice of a word can make a big difference in terms of its impact associated with it. Now, we look at the outrage, fault, and fear by analyzing the reach, the context, and the acceleration of each one of those dimensions. We're going to go into this a little bit more, and we'll hit these topics quickly today. Later, we'll do a more detailed version of this, but we wanted you to at least have a way to look at how is this crisis affecting us versus how is it affecting others. And many of these things you can see externally in a crisis. It can be evaluated very quickly. So this is a speed is a quality situation. You can look at, this is where we were when we found out. This is where we are 8 hours into the crisis, 24, 7 days, a month later to determine it. So it gives you these point specifics, and then that lets you understand, is our message going out? Is it being understood? What's causing the problem for us at this point? Where should we put our attention and focus on it? And I'm sorry, can you hear me? Nope. So if you look at those areas, it becomes a difference, and we do a scoring on a Likert scale, 1 to 5 associated with it. So if you look at the chart down at the bottom to create the crisis index, you've got the dimensions of outrage, fault, and fear. If there are none, is it at a guarded, elevated, an imminent, or severe level as you're measuring the level of outrage? Across the top of the page, you'll see descriptors describing outrage, fault, and fear, and then you'll look at the rating here in terms of reach, context, and acceleration. If you've got a problem with the volume, the tone, or the source of the communications, are you being talked about in the penny saver, or are you being talked about as the lead story on CNN? The context, the significance, the magnitude, the extent of the impact. 140 million people having their identity stolen certainly has a greater impact than one. Well, if that one person happened to have been the President of the United States, one might be enough, but it's the context, the significance. And then the acceleration, is this growing in volume, or is it decreasing? Is it stabilizing? So this gives you a framework. Ultimately, these then are mapped into a heat map, and I'll give you a little bit of an idea of what that looks like in just a moment as it comes together. But it gives us a way to map those dimensions so that we can follow the fluid aspect of this. And then once it's mapped, once it's understood where it is today versus where it was yesterday, or where we anticipate it to tomorrow, that life cycle of the crisis then focuses our decisions, actions, and words. Specifically, we view real and perceived or anticipated impacts of outrage, fault, and fear. We're evaluating those consequences and impacts based upon their reach, context, and acceleration. So I'd look at the outrage in terms of reach. I'd look at outrage in terms of context. I'd look at outrage in terms of acceleration. And then we'd use it to manage the events, the decisions, actions, and words. Now, I didn't put the coloration in the background to show you the different blocks of where things shift and move, but I gave you a little bit of a framework. So if you've got events that are very low in terms of outrage and low in terms of reach and acceleration and context, those events are what we would generally review as guarded, and those might be handled at a site level. Maybe they're having a problem and it's not of significant magnitude and it stays there. Your event activation matrix that you designed within your business continuity plan would help to frame those elements with you. If it's a little bit more and in that mid-range and it's elevated, it comes up, and so it'd be handled at a management level, a level within the organization, your incident response team, if you will. If it continues to accelerate, it would be up at a leadership level, your senior suite, your office, senior leadership, even a notification to the board. So looking at these plotted on a heat map, and you're plotting both each one of those elements and each one of their sources with context, acceleration, and reach adding together. So you've got a region that maps in, and you can look at that over time. As we move from that, again, coming back and looking at the decisions you make, the actions you take, and the words that you say. Firestorm has a program that we will make available to you at no cost called Crisis Stop. And it's that first hour that's the most critical. The STOP stands for stable the events, understanding what's going on associated with them. T is trigger the resources, internal, external. Do we need counselors? Have we the insurance company? Do we have the outside attorney involved? What help do we need at that point? O is to opine on the consequences. What's going to happen next associated with it? And P is to prevent the common crisis mistakes. And we see those same mistakes over and over associated with it. So if you concentrate picking up the pieces on that first hour, looking at the crisis index, understanding outrage, is there fault, is there fear, looking at those core assets that are where you are, that will then influence your decisions, your actions, and your words. And those three combined together will determine, is this going to stabilize or is it going to escalate? I'm going to show you the maturity model again and talk about it in this respect, but before I jump on, I know you were talking about these subjects today and at ASIS. Anything you want to add from what I've said?
No, just to really reiterate the fact that understanding where you are in the crisis is incredibly powerful and incredibly important. There are certain things that you would want to be able to do at certain points in time where many people have a rush in the beginning of a crisis to try and do them all at once right up front because that's all they know necessarily what to do. And then there's a surprise at the end of the day that when we don't do the right things at the right time for the right type of an event, we're often surprised by the negative reaction from everybody else involved. So that in the ability to think through the first hour and then think through the first day and then the next 72 hours, and unfortunately for many of these events you're having to think through the next year, the next 18 months, is that it's important to get the right part of the process at the right point in time where people are ready to hear and ready to follow through with the message that you're trying to deliver. So the crisis stop process and the crisis index process deliver that mechanism to not only do the right thing in the beginning, but to make sure that you're following through and using metrics to help ensure that what you're doing is having an impact positively for your organization. So these kinds of things we see over and over that are unfortunately the kinds of mistakes that organizations make in a rush to judgment early on.
And once you've done it incorrectly, you're now in an explaining mode, and you'll find that you're losing in that crisis. So this is the foundation if we're going to start to think about data-driven crisis management. Where we are in that index, what the cause of where we are becomes very important, and this brings you clarity. Because if we're dealing with an issue that's about outrage, that would temper the words and the actions and the decisions we make. If it's driven by fault, if we're deemed at fault, if this occurred, then we take a completely different stand in response with our decisions, actions, and words. And that's the takeaway we wanted you to get from this portion of our conversation. If we look at it in its totality, it's around crisis management, and there's a maturity model. In anything, we're looking at how mature is our organization, how mature are our people. One great piece of advice is the more that you go through this, the more you exercise and look at decisions at a strategic level and let your senior leadership say, this is what we're trying to do and learn, you'll find that the performance will be improved as opposed to the first time they come together and look at it. Along the left-hand side, you'll see listed the dimensions of what's your decision process, the roles and responsibilities, the information clarity, the speed of decision making, and your communications effectiveness. Now, like any maturity model, you measure it across 4 different stages of where an organization is. Stage 1 is that everything's a liability. It comes as a surprise. A stage 2 organization is moved up to kind of having the basics in place, but they're still in a reactive mode. Stage 3, it becomes supportive, and there's pre-action things that are put in place in advance. And stage 4, it's strategic. It's a part of your culture. If you look at each of these 5 dimensions, you will probably find that you're in different boxes in different columns as you go across. But if you want to measure the full impact on your organization, it will be the lowest rating that's going to drive the crisis management in that event that you're in. So until you improve, you can do the best thing in the world, but if you waited on decision making and you had slow processes, events outpace leaders, serious confusion consumes the executive team, if you were stuck in that first box, even though you might have a lot of other things on the chart, you're going to be drawn back to that level as a company. One of the other uses of this tool is if you do a tabletop exercise, take it and use it to let the group self-evaluate. We did an exercise yesterday virtually with a bank group, and they were rating themselves at a strategic level. And I'm not quite sure that they would be at that level across all of these dimensions. And in fact, based upon what I observed, they weren't. So thinking about those things becomes very important. Every time you can move from a stage 1 to a 2 or 3 or a 4, you have a breakthrough. Notice that as you get from being in an organization where everything's a surprise and is at a liability, once you get to that basic reaction level, you've had a control breakthrough. There's now control in place within your organization. As you move up to the supportive level, you're in an alignment breakthrough. Now everything's starting to line up and become that way. But the true benefit comes when you can hit that strategic and part of your culture. That's where the value breakthrough comes through. In understanding the crisis, understanding where you are and what that index is a fundamental area. We follow a predict, plan, perform methodology. All of those combine to build a comprehensive program. You need to understand the risk and the threats and the vulnerabilities, their impacts, and how you're going to monitor them. What are the triggers to activate your plans, as well as what will the decisions be that we make? What are the words that we're going to say? Let's think about it today. What's the worst thing that could happen in your organization? If it does, what are the words that you're going to say? The plans of the policies and procedures and programs that you'd have in place. Performing then is the training, the testing of it, the open source intelligence to monitor it and to come together. Now, a crisis is not business as usual, it's business as unusual. In many of these cases, you need a crisis coach that's worked through those with you before. There will be a brief on today's webinar. It will picking up the pieces at critical decision support after a crisis, and you can get that at Firestorm.com briefs. Now, it's not going to be up on the website until next week, but you'll get that, and you'll have copies of some of the slides associated with it, as well as a narrative explaining it. It would be a good one to share within your organization. We've also recorded today's webinar, and it'll be available on demand shortly from the Firestorm website. If you've got questions, you can go to that website, firestorm.com, or you can send us an email at webinars@firestorm.com, or you can call us at 800-321-2219. We're here 24/7. If you find yourself in a crisis, we're ready to help. Hart, any last comment before we let everyone have their day back?
I appreciate everybody's time and such an important topic, certainly as we see things playing out in the news today. And certainly we are here to help as much as we possibly can if and when the unfortunate events occur to those of you on the call. So thank you very much for your time, and certainly appreciate your efforts in this space.
Thanks, everybody, and look for more updates next month. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day. Goodbye.